I've got 4 questions here to frame this interim report. I think it's really important to remember that this is an interim report, and the purpose of it is to inform the practical, what we call action research in my profession, of the second stage of the project. Okay, this is not a report on how dreadfully theatres deal with people who have caring responsibilities. That's not the purpose of the research. It really is here to identify what we're going to do next, and the focus of the final report will be on that part of the process. Okay, my questions. Who responded to the survey? What does it suggest are the consequences of caring responsibilities for people working in the theatre? What could be done to support people facing these challenges? And are there conflicts between the agenda of supporting people with caring responsibilities and the working culture in theatres? Okay, let's start with who responded. So, the first thing to say is that our respondents are more likely to be female than the general population. We've got the census data on the right here, which is more or less 50%, slightly more female in the general population. The theatre's employee data is on the left, slightly more female than male. Our data is much more female than male, which reflects a finding which we're going to discover as we go along, which is that in spite of decades of work on this, caring responsibilities are still seen as women's work. And so I assume they identify this as being more relevant to them, and therefore they're more likely to respond to the survey. In terms of marital status, we're pretty much with the population. We've got a slightly lower proportion of widowed and divorced people, which I think is partly to do with the fact that our respondents are a little bit younger than the average population. But basically, we've got a very similar spread to the 2011 census in our respondents. If we look at ethnicity, that 76% is white British. We've got quite a high proportion of white European, that's that 10% there. And that sort of fan at the top is all of the non-white categories. Okay? Now, that looks bad from a diversity point of view, but actually it's not drastically out of line with the population as a whole. We've got 93.7% in white categories. The population has 86%. There is an interesting discrepancy here in terms of the representation of British Asian people, but actually research into diversity in the theatre has identified that they are significantly underrepresented working in theatres and represented on stages already, so that shouldn't really come as a surprise. Broadly then, we're with the population, we're a bit whiter. Age-wise, we're a bit younger. You can see we've got a good spread. 32.7% are 25 to 34, and the biggest category is 35 to 44, against probably kind of parents with young children. And then as the respondents get older, there are fewer of them, particularly not very many people above 55. So people who have caring responsibilities above 55 are probably underrepresented in the data, and that's something which I'll come to later on. Okay. In terms of the roles of the jobs that people do, again, we've got a pretty good spread. I would say that probably administration and management and creative people are slightly overrepresented in relation to, for example, performers and technical and production and stage managers. And we've hardly got anybody in maintenance or in front of house. That might be because you're more likely to have agency staff working in those roles, possibly. I know that some theatres do. It might be that you franchise out some of your front of house provision. Larger theatres do that. And it might just be that those people are working in precarious shift patterns and don't really identify as working in theatre. But anyway, they are definitely very much underrepresented in the data. And technical and production and stage management possibly, I think, slightly underrepresented too. But again, a good spread. In terms of income, you probably won't be surprised to hear that most of the people who responded are earning less than the national average. So the national average for the tax year ending the 5th of April 2015 was £27,600. So that would fall into this category here, which is the biggest category. But if you can imagine a standard, a bell curve, a standard deviation curve, you'd expect this bar to be higher if you had a standard deviation based on the average income of the population. So we're more likely, these respondents are more likely to be earning under the national average than above it. And that is significant, I think, when we come along to the costs of caring later on, in terms of how much as a proportion of their income people are spending on childcare and other kinds of cost of caring. Okay, in terms of their employment terms, they are much, much more likely to be self-employed than the average people in the population. So I'll just get the data here. Nationally, the share of self-employed people in total employment between January and March 2016 was only 14.87%, and we've got 45% self-employed. That said, the share of self-employment across the population is growing. It's a trend over a number of years. So I expect that this data may be ahead of a national trend. And actually, in terms of the significance of the research, that might be important, as we see, sociologists talking a lot about the gig economy and portfolio careers, and people who are either completely self-employed now, where they might have been employed before, or blending employment and self-employment. And that, again, is a feature of the research, which we'll see as we go along. Interestingly enough, not that many people identified their positions as permanent, which I'm not sure whether that was the term that they didn't get. But lots of people said they were full-time, 38%, and only 12.7% said permanent. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe just there's a feeling of impermanence. Okay, so now, consequences. The first thing to point out, and slightly to just get this out of the way because it will be reflected through all of the rest of the data, is that there are gendered differences in terms of how care is perceived and who does it and who feels that it is their responsibility. Okay, so men and women, the question was, men and women are treated differently by the organisations they work for after becoming parents. Do you strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree? And we can see that 34% strongly agree that men and women are treated differently. So even if they're not, the perception is quite strongly that they are, and another 34% agreed with that, and only 9% in the two disagree categories. So only 9% of people felt confident that they could disagree with that statement. And I've put in a quotation from an anonymous respondent here who said, one employer said, "I never employ mothers." One other said, "She always thinks of my baby when she thinks of working with me." And those are kind of representative of the kinds of things that people say. If we try and work out some numbers for this, it's slightly complicated, this graph. What we said to people was, if you share the childcare with a partner, what proportion do you take and what proportion does your partner take? So if we go down the line here, this is I do 10%, my partner does 90%. This is I do 20%, my partner does 80%. This is I do 30%, my partner does 70%, and so on. So, okay, I've provocatively coloured them. Twice as many men as women reported doing 10% of the childcare. Stunned surprise. About the same number of men and women reported doing 20% of the childcare, we can see there. About twice as many men as women reported at 30 and 40% of the childcare, and we can see that the number of men is diminishing from now on. So basically, if you share the childcare and you are a man, you are much, much, much more than likely to be doing less than your partner is. I should say, it seems from the data that most of the people who reported are in heterosexual relationships. So usually we're dealing with a man and a woman. Not exclusively, but usually in terms of our respondents. Slightly more women reported doing 60% of the childcare as opposed to their partner doing 40%, and a massively bigger proportion reported doing 70% where their partner does 30%, and only women, down here on the bottom right, reported doing 100% of the childcare. So we can see that that basically, as I've already said, women are seen as being the responsible carers. In fact, I could say anecdotally from my own experience, when my children were young and I was the primary carer and delivered them to other kind of forms of childcare and did all of that, the nursery, for example, would still call my wife, in spite of the fact that it was me that took them every day. And she was away at work and couldn't do anything about it. So this is clearly kind of, anecdotally you see that across the results. Okay. Now, obviously, women usually get the raw end of this deal, but actually there are also some men who suffer as a consequence of this perception too. Not very many, but there are some. So we see things like, my partner has never had his needs taken into consideration as a parent. Even when he was full-time carer and worked 2 evening shifts a week, I've had more put in place to get me back to work. So it seems that employers are tending to assume that it'll be women, and that that has a negative consequence if you are a man who is doing this childcare, as well as obviously if you were just a woman. Okay. If we try to work out how gender is affecting the kinds of work people do, the results aren't quite so clear, but we can, slightly more women than men are identifying as self-employed. I think the only significant finding here really is that if you are working full-time, you are much more likely to be a man. And actually, since we also find that most of the provisions for childcare are steered towards full-time employees, they're therefore steered towards, in our respondents anyway, mainly men, who aren't usually carrying the burdens of the care. So that is, it seems, kind of important. Okay, so let's. I'm going to put gender to one side, although, as I say, it is imbricated through all of these findings inevitably. Okay. What about loss of earnings? Have you turned down work because of care and responsibilities? 81% of self-employed people said they'd turned down work because it was incompatible with a caring responsibility. But actually, in a way, I wasn't terribly surprised by that, I have to say. I was more surprised to discover that 57% of employed people said that they'd turned down work because it was incompatible with a caring responsibility. And this seems to fit a pattern of less distinction between employment and self-employment than certainly I expected, and I think that you might expect in terms of the challenges that people face. We hear things like, I chose to not work away from home and to move into more creative and management roles that didn't require me to work full runs of shows. I've turned down designing jobs which are either too far away and not practical, and/or because I know the workload isn't feasible with my childcare. When the children were small, I turned down opportunities at other theatres. I used to work in stage management, but this was not a practical career choice with young children, and so on and so on. So lots of people are finding that when care and responsibilities enter their life, they're having to turn down work. And some of them are changing jobs as well, which I'll come to. And as I say, I think there may be a higher degree of overlap between the categories of employment and self-employment, or possibly kind of porosity in that people move between employment and self-employment. Okay. Next one. It's not moving on. Here we go. Then the next thing we asked was about loss of potential earnings. So not just losing earning, but losing the potential to earn. And we asked if you were unable to attend auditions, meetings or rehearsals because of a lack of alternative care arrangements. So this graph has, let's get this right, it's divided into people who are either employed or self-employed and have caring responsibilities not involving dependent children. That's the top line. That's this colour here. So they're employed or self-employed and care for someone who is not a dependent child. Okay. The second line is employed people with child dependents in the middle, and the bottom line is self-employed people with child dependents. Okay, PNTSs prefer not to say, by the way. Okay, so we can see that whether they're employed or self-employed, people with child dependents are likely to be missing opportunities to earn. Certainly once a year and very often once a month. So pretty frequently. It's not just not being able to earn, it's also not being able to get jobs or even get the opportunity to get a job. But there's also, I think, an important finding here that there is a significant minority of people who are working in the theatre who have care and responsibilities for people who are not children. And sometimes, by the way, these people also have children to care for, and the data is not terribly clear about where exactly those overlaps are, but clearly some of them also have children. And the largest proportion of these people, it is true, never experience loss of potential earnings, right? So we look, 40.9% of these people don't apparently experience loss of potential earnings, but they're also the group who are most likely to have very, very frequent calls on their time. So of the people who lose these opportunities once a week, the largest proportion of people who don't have children but do have care and responsibilities. From looking at the narrative comments, it looks like these are people who, for example, are caring for their parents, or not very many reported actually caring for disabled adults. They tended to be elderly people they were caring for. And so I guess I would assume that means that for a limited period of time, you have a lot of responsibilities and very regular calls on your time. And so we're calling this pattern kind of hidden caring, and we'll see why as we go on. So it's not just parents, although parents clearly are commonly losing opportunities to get work. At the same time, it should be pointed out that there are, in the low 20s% of people who say that their care and responsibilities don't ever, if they've got children anyway, don't ever impact upon their ability to gain work. So clearly there are some people who are arranging childcare and it's fine. Okay? Which begs a couple of further questions, I think. One is, what kind of childcare are they arranging? And, is that dependent upon other forms of social advantage, for example? And we'll see that I think it probably is a bit. And it certainly begs another question, which is, what about people who just drop out because they don't even get to this point here? So there are those people to consider as well. Okay. So, organising childcare. We've got a big range of different kinds of childcare. It's interesting that the most flexible forms of childcare and those, I guess, most tied to social advantage are basically not used. So au pairs and nannies, we don't really have. We're very surprised by that. We get school, we've got childminders, we've got after-school club. But actually, the biggest proportions are nurseries and family member. Okay, so and when you look at the narrative comments, they say things like, this requires flexibility in the help of family and friends. I've always managed to find some assistance via other parents, family, friend, though sometimes with difficulty. Family have normally been able to step in, but I feel uncomfortable relying so heavily on their availability to allow me to work. So clearly, there is a kind of hidden reliance, or not so hidden reliance, on grandparents and other family members and possibly friends in kind of sharing agreements to step in and provide support. Okay? And that, I would argue, is a kind of form of social advantage. If you're a parent and your parents aren't working and have an income and can therefore do free childcare, then that applies to a very specific part of the population as a whole, I would say. Okay. If we look at the costs of childcare, I can't currently tell you what, as a proportion of people's earning, they're spending on childcare. That would be very complicated. But, we're getting a lot of people spending up to 50 quid a week on childcare. Quite a number of people spending up to £100 a week. So that's got to be getting up to the level of their mortgage, I would have thought, over a month. Well, maybe not quite. But if you consider this is one person's income, that's probably the level of their contribution to their mortgage or something like that. Which, anecdotally from my own experience, I remember spending more than my mortgage on childcare for some periods of time when I had two children who were young. So yeah. So they're spending a significant proportion of their income anyway. Okay. So if we look at employed as against self-employed people, there's just really one finding here I want to point out, and then we'll come on to some others in a minute. 55% of self-employed people say that childcare support does not apply to them. Okay, so they perceive that there is no opportunity for any kind of childcare or support with getting childcare from the organisations who they usually work for. Not applicable, 55% of self-employed people. Now, that, it seems to me, is that, they say things like, I'm freelance, self-employed, so there is no organisation offering support or training. I'm self-employed, so it's not really relevant. I'm self-employed, therefore I don't have anyone to give me that support. This is not applicable as I work freelance, and so on and so on and so on. So there's loads and loads and loads of self-employed people basically assume that, whether it's true or not, there isn't any support for them. Now, one of the categories here is maternity leave, or maternity pay, and maternity allowance is available for self-employed people based on Class 2 national insurance contributions. And obviously I can't tell you this as a fact, but it looks to me as though there are quite a number of self-employed people who are just not aware of that fact. And in fact, the government has recently changed the rules surrounding this, so you have to work a higher number of weeks and the test period of weeks that they assess your maternity allowance against has reduced. So actually I would imagine if you're a performer, certainly, having to have worked for 26 weeks of the 66 weeks before you have your child is pretty unrealistic. So unless you did a load of adverts for things for pregnant women, I think you're not going to have done that. So there are, they're possibly being further disadvantaged by legislation and may not even be aware that the legislation is there in the first place. So clearly there is a need to kind of train our focus a bit on self-employed people. Okay. So this is current provisions on the left-hand side and additional support that people would like on the right-hand side. And we can see that all forms of childcare offered by employers are very popular with both employed and self-employed people at the bottom right-hand side there. And we can also see that they're almost never available. So bottom left-hand side, there's almost no childcare, flexible after-hours emergency, creche or whatever, provided by employers currently in this sector, which we knew in a way, but that confirms it. And people would definitely like that. We might expect self-employed people to be a bit more keen on emergency childcare, but they don't seem to be that keen on emergency childcare. So again, we seem to find that employed and self-employed people are facing similar kinds of challenges. Self-employed people are a bit more keen on flexible childcare, rather than committing to particular days, I assume. But they're actually emergency childcare, they're not much more keen on it than people who are employed. And we can see that part-time work is a lot more popular in theory than it is in practice, and it's more popular, predictably enough, as are reduced hours with people who are employed rather than people who are self-employed, who I think feel that that is basically a way of losing work, and losing work in the long run in a way that employed people probably don't. Okay. Like I said, the most popular measure, though, amongst both employed and the second most popular measure amongst self-employed people is flexible hours. There are clearly about twice as many employed people as self-employed people currently taking advantage of flexible hours, but a lot more would like to, clearly, from this. And self-employed people would like it as well as employed people. So unlike part-time work or reduced hours, flexible hours seems to appeal to both employed and self-employed people, which is significant, I think. In fact, if we asked if everybody could benefit from flexible working, not just people with care and responsibilities, then the huge majority agreed with that. Only 2% disagreed that flexible working could benefit all workers, regardless of their care and responsibilities. And this is regardless of what position the respondent is in. So whether or not they have care and responsibilities, they think that flexible working is a good idea for people, whether or not they have care and responsibilities too. That said, there are comments. If you read the narrative comments, you see a bit of a pattern emerging that flexible working is not always arranged to the mutual benefit of employers and employees. So you hear things about late night phone calls, emailing regularly out of hours, and people's anxiety about, for example, leaving the office at a time when other people aren't leaving the office, and hearing kind of comments about that, even though they may be working flexibly and working at home later on or something. So although flexible working is really, really popular and clearly is something which should be investigated, there don't seem to be loads and loads of great models for its application currently in the industry. There may well be some, but certainly our respondents don't report on them. So I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that. Okay, there is, however, one form of flexible working which is well known to everybody who works in a theatre, and that is last-minute commitments. So we asked if you were frequently confronted with last-minute professional commitments, engagements, or changes in working schedules due to the nature of your work. And of all the people who responded, 79% said yes. It puts an immense strain on my partner, also has a reactive and stressful job. It frustrates everyone and creates tension. There's a constant feeling of stress about logistics and worries around the kind of care arrangements that people have put in place because of last-minute commitments cropping up. Okay, so this is moving on now to working culture and whether there's a kind of conflict here between the working culture that we have in theatre and the ways in which people with care and responsibilities have to organise their lives. One person said, "I'm always pulling favours with people. It causes resentment between us." If we break this down into employed and self-employed people, again we see more self-employed people have last-minute commitments than employed people, 83%, but still 62% of people who are employed are reporting having last-minute working commitments, which suggests to me that there's a culture of that kind of thing just happening as a norm. I mean, I know that because I've worked in the theatre for years, but you know, this is data, not just what I experienced. Okay. Another aspect of the working culture which comes out quite strongly from the report is extended hours and family unfriendly hours. Again, this is kind of predictable, but it is clearly a real issue for people. And these are some of the comments here that we get when we ask about this. I think it's important, you know, when someone says I regularly miss family time, usually weekends and events, I do feel the entertainment business is not family friendly, early or late call times or finishes, long distance travelling and so on. I mean, clearly some of these things are not going to change. You know, working in the evenings is not about to change. I mean, so we're stuck with that. But there are some things which come out of this, which is, for example, do you have opportunities to discuss solutions with your employers? How possible is it for people to make alterations to working patterns, maybe for a few years and then to revert to a more normal working pattern? Is there support for people changing roles because these issues are just too difficult for them to address and they can't manage it? And are there deeper assumptions kind of embedded in the working culture of theatres that make extended hours more likely at key points? For example, when you're drawing up a production schedule, do you tacitly rely on the fact that everyone will work overtime at certain points, or things will just kind of get done, or you know, are you planning to avoid that? And that's, you know, I think that's something which could be done potentially. Okay, I'm going to address those key points quickly and then finish. Right, we asked about, can you discuss these responsibilities with the people who employ you? Do you feel confident about doing that? And the good news is that workers who are parents with child dependents are more likely to feel confident asking for practical measures to be taken to help them than not. So 36%, these are the ones in the middle, would feel confident asking the organisations they work for about that, and only 32% wouldn't. I mean, that hangs in the balance a bit, but clearly they're slightly more confident than not about discussing these issues. It is still significant that a third, though, so a third of parents with child dependents would not feel confident discussing practical support with their employer, although some of them seem to take the position on principle rather than because they think they'd be dealt with unfavourably. So some people just say, it's none of their business, I'm there to work, I don't need to discuss it with them, kind of on principle. And other people clearly feel that if they discussed it, they might be at a disadvantage. So there's a mix. They do say things like they're not interested in me, they're interested in getting the job done. I don't think they could care less. To be fair, though, I'm an actor, I wouldn't expect them to. So, you know, I mean, those are pretty harsh. But I think there are two further findings here which I want to deal with. One is the people who are most likely to feel confident about asking their organisations for support to enable them to balance work and care and responsibilities are the people who do not have any care and responsibilities. So if you look at this one on the right, the people who don't have care and responsibilities say that 43% of them agree or strongly agree that they would feel confident asking these organisations to do things like reducing hours, working remotely and so on. So it seems like the more responsibilities you have, the less likely you are slightly to feel confident about actually asking for them. And perhaps relatedly, the people who are least likely to want to discuss these things are people who are caring for non-child dependents. Yeah, and we'll see a little bit more of that in a second. And even if we lower the bar slightly, so the previous question was about what about practical things like, you know, placing a bar on emails at certain times or working remotely or whatever. This was just discussing it in any way at all. And even if we lower the bar by asking that question, we get a similar kind of response. And again, we see people with care and responsibilities but no child dependents. 47% of them would feel confident, but still 17 and 13, so 30% of them still say that they wouldn't, and 23% are neutral. And again, people who don't have care and responsibilities think it would be fine to discuss them. I think in a way that's good news, right? Because it means that they feel, those people who don't have care and responsibilities feel that there is an openness in the organisations they work for about these issues, and they feel like like it would be fine. The problem comes with what actually can be done practically, and I think that people feel that that's less possible the more that they actually experience these responsibilities for themselves. I wonder also whether this is an unforeseen consequence of legislation around not being able to ask people about their family situations, for example, in job interviews. Whether we get into a habit culturally of saying, no, we don't ask you if you're married or you're planning on having children or whatever in a job interview for very, very good reasons, but then we also then, once we've employed you, don't talk to you about those things. That's a hunch, but it's a possibility. If we ask whether your organisation has ever asked you about your needs as a carer, then we find that even people with children, it's hard to hide the fact that you have a child, usually, even they, say 59% of them say no, their organisation or their manager has never asked them about their needs as a carer. People with other caring responsibilities, so not for children, 73% of them have not been asked about those responsibilities, and I think it may be because they're invisible. Because they're hidden, we don't see them. We hear things like having kids is considered a joy and a celebration, but caring for an elderly relative is supposed to be an embarrassment. I don't think it would be appropriate to discuss my caring responsibilities and may jeopardise my position. That's from someone who doesn't have a child dependent, who's caring for someone who's not a child. So clearly, there doesn't seem to be a culture of asking about these things, and some people's caring responsibilities seem to be hidden. If we ask about what happens whether you've changed or adapted your role, and whether you were given support and training to manage that process, we find that only 14% of people say they were given good support and training to change their role when they changed their role as a result of having a caring responsibility, and quite a number disagree or strongly disagree with that. We did an analysis of the narrative comments. It's called a thematic analysis, so you try and pull themes out of what people are saying in narrative comments, and we find in there that 20% of them mention employers being supportive, but then a tiny fraction just here mention actual concrete support being given. So a feeling of supportiveness is relatively common, actual concrete support, not common. We also find that support is not offered much more often than it is refused. Very few people reported that support had actually been refused for changing a job, but a lot of people said it wasn't offered. Again, we have self-employed people here counting themselves out and saying, oh, well, I'm self-employed, so there's no one to support me. And that may be true, but I think it's a question that we need to be asking whether there should be or whether there could be people to support self-employed people in this situation. We often find narrative comments saying there are informal conversations, or my manager's a parent too, so they understand and they deal with things. So these things seem to happen predominantly as a result of the initiative either of an individual manager or, and in fact more commonly, the initiative of the parent or carer who wants to change their role. When that happens, employers are clearly quite often supportive, but the initiative seems to come from the employee rather than from some kind of process that their manager is committed to. We also see that when people say that they are changing their role to a part-time role, that almost in all cases involved a reduction in responsibility. So it's not simply a reduction in hours. Whenever people mention reduction is in hours, they also mention reductions in responsibility. Which makes me ask, is there a kind of presenteeism going on here where the idea of being in the office or in the building in another place is equated with being able to take responsibility for things? And therefore the assumption is, oh, you can go part-time, that's fine, but you have to take less responsibility. And that's not, that's not necessary. That's a decision. Okay, so we've got some main findings of this stage of the research, I think. We find that the burden of childcare falls disproportionately on women. We find that self-employed people are significantly disadvantaged by current provisions for childcare support. We find that employment and self-employment are not mutually exclusive categories, and those people often face similar challenges in terms of managing the balance between their work and their care and responsibilities. We find that flexible working is extremely popular but largely untested. Most solutions to balancing work and care and responsibilities are informally arranged at the instigation of the employee. Part-time work is commonly seen as a form of demotion. Some care and responsibilities are invisible to employers. And there's a working culture in theatres that disadvantages people with caring responsibilities. You see a lot of stage management and technical and production staff who just say you just simply cannot do the job and have a young child, for example, in the way that it's framed at the moment. Now that might be right, that might be true. It might just be that that's the case, you can't do it. But it seems to me that there are discussions to be had around that. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry, for some of you, I was aware as I was speaking that who manage staff, that might have been quite uncomfortable. I'm not, as I said at the beginning, I'm not presenting this as any kind of indictment. And certainly we're not going to sort of send out the message that theatres are dreadful places to work if you have children or you have care and responsibilities. The message is we're doing something about it, but there are really significant challenges which were built into a system of working which was not created with the needs of parents and carers in mind. So I want to frame that positively as we're coming together here now to talk about how to adapt a model of working which really was built with the needs of a relatively small and relatively privileged group of people in mind. But actually, if you look across the population as a whole, you find that more and more people are doing the kinds of creative, self-employed work that people in theatres have been doing for a very, very long time, and that if you look at how much caring those people do, they don't do very much, because they work very, very, very long hours, they work very, very, very flexibly, and they take responsibility for all of that, for that flexibility. And that's people not just in theatres, that's people who work for advertising agencies, that's particularly, I'm really aware of it, people who work for universities. So this isn't particular to the theatre, and I think it's really positive that we're engaging in trying to address these issues, but they are tricky.